All right. Good evening. Yeah, we're ready to get going here. Thanks for joining us. There are a few people in the foyer who are coming. Ooh, I left my marker over here. Um, as a as a point of recap, I wanted to talk with us about kind of where we've been for a couple things, and the reason I want to do this is because it leads us into this week. Um, so where we have been, we have been. We've seen God reveal himself. We've seen the preface and God showing what the book is going to be about. We've seen these instructions from God, and we've seen the failures of people over and over again. And about the time that we think, man, this is really, really tough, this is really bad, we get the introduction of this guy named Avram. And the thing about Avram is we often just look at Genesis 12:1 and pick up the story there, but we picked up the story in Genesis 11, and we're introduced to Avram and this willingness of a man to not think of himself, but to think of think of others ahead of himself. And Iscah, or Sarai, is taken as his wife, and we're told that she's barren. So he intentionally takes this barren woman as his wife. It just speaks to his character. And then he leaves his father's house and all of the security, and he takes along Lot, and he goes to this place that God is showing him. And when he finally gets there, God tells him to settle. And if we've been following the story up to then, we go, why would you want him to settle, God? He's going to build a tower for himself. He's going to try to make a name for himself. He's going to forget about you. But Avram does something that's very different than everybody else. He builds a tent and lives in a tent, and he is mobile, but he builds that tower of sorts. He builds an altar out of stone to make God's name permanent and him to be mobile. Then he grows in stature. He makes mistakes, but he continues forward. He allows Lot to leave, which is a big deal because he brought Lot along thinking that was going to be where his offspring and his name came through, but he didn't. So he continues on, and what we see after that is God. He allows Lot to leave, and then God makes this covenant and this commitment and this blood path, right? That's what we talked about last week. And God changes his name to, God doesn't change his name yet. He gives him the blood path, and then tells him he's going to have a baby. It's going to come from him. He talks to his wife. Well, God didn't mention Sarai. So he ends up with this baby from Hagar. And right on the backside of that, God makes a covenant with Abram, and he changes Abram's name to Abraham, and he changes Sarai's name to Sarah on the backside of a covenant, and he gives them the sign of circumcision. And that's where the story has ended before now. That's where the pause has been in the story. So what does Abraham do? What does Abraham do? He circumcises everyone in his household, including himself. And Abraham is 99, according to the story in Genesis 17. So now we pick up the story today in Genesis 18, verse 1. It says, "The Lord appeared to Abraham near the great trees of Mamre while he was sitting at the entrance to his tent in the heat of the day. So the first question I have for you is, why is Abraham sitting in his tent in the heat of the day? He's recovering from a major change in life at 99 years old. He's recovering. So, if we just pick up the story if you just start reading the story in Genesis 18:1, you're like, okay, well, Abram's resting in his tent. No, he's resting in the tent because he's in the recovery room from surgery. Yeah. Recovery, right? Yes. While they were still sore, it tells us. Yeah. So Abraham is recovering. And Abraham looked up and he saw 3 men standing nearby. I think it's interesting that the Lord visited and it's 3 men. This is all pieces that we should take in. So, and when he saw them, he hurried from the entrance of his tent to meet them, and he bowed low to the ground. A lot of people immediately go, well, he hurried to them, he ran to them. But that's not normal. It's very abnormal for the patriarch in this culture to do anything fast. He walks, he does stuff intentionally. Running is not a thing. He's going to run later in the story, but the fact that he's hurrying is out of the ordinary. It means that he's thinking of himself as lesser than this person who has showed up. And he doesn't know them. And the Bible doesn't give us indication that he recognizes them as the Lord. We're told that the Lord visited, but that is, in hindsight, retelling the story. Because how he interacts, it doesn't use the same verbiage. And so he bowed low to the ground. He says, if I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, do not pass your servant by. Let a little water be brought, and then you may all wash your feet and rest under this tree. Let me get you something to eat so you can be refreshed and then go on your way, now that you have come to your servant. So he just is welcoming these people. And one thing that you're going to need to understand about the culture in the Middle East is all those people trace their lineage back to Abraham. And they believe that because they are children of Abraham, they are hospitable. There's the guy that much of this study comes from, Marty Solomon. He makes trips over there. And the first trip he made there, his rabbi, his teacher, takes this group of people. He doesn't tell them what's going on. And they're in this Muslim part of Syria. And they come over this hill. And off in the distance, you can see this tent, this dwelling place of people. And he walks, Ray, their leader, is walking directly toward it. And so you have 54 people, including Ray, all of them American Christians. 54 walking directly at what they can only assume to be a Muslim village. And so they're walking in the direction of this village, a little bit skeptical of like, what's about to happen? What are we doing? Like, we've been taught all these things. These people don't like me. They hate me. They are out to kill me. They are out to destroy me. And when they saw them from afar off, the young kids between the ages of 4 and 7 all come out of the village and run out and meet the people, smiling, celebrating them, holding them by the hand, walking them the last half mile all the way into the village. The first house that they come to is this woman's house. And she invited everyone into her home. 54 unannounced guests. The only announcement they got was, I see them at a long distance off, and they're walking in this direction. So what do? She brings them in, lets them rest in her house, and she begins to go house to house to her friends to get all the supplies necessary. She gets 54 cups out of her cupboard, and you're thinking, who in the world has 54 cups? I probably could get pretty close to the number of, but these are all 54 glasses. And she feeds them and brings them fresh water and fresh drinks and tea and all of this stuff until all the food runs out. For hours, entertaining them, making sure that they are home, that they are... And here's the deal. We look at that and go, there's no way. Like, this should be a convicting challenge for us. Because if our enemy, if people who we have been told are against us and are our enemies showed up at our door, most of us would just close the door and pretend we weren't there. These people show up and invite everybody in and treat them like they're their own. And this goes back to Abraham. And when asked directly by a person, they finally found somebody in town who could speak English and brought them into the party and allowed them to operate as a translator. And when they asked directly through this translator, why? You're obviously a Muslim. Why would you entertain all of us? And what is it that you hope for in life? And she gets on her knees in the middle of the room and points all around, and she says this: I want peace. I want people who are close, who can be close, and to show people the love of our father Abraham. I want peace with all people. That's what I want. Like, we're painted this picture, and this dates itself back to, all of these different people groups will point back to Abraham. And the challenge is for us, if we are this people of faith, and Abraham is our father of faith, then why is it so hard for us to allow people close? Why is it so hard for us? And here's what Ray said to these people as they're waiting, as there's lulls. He goes to all of them and he says, your American experience, you are going to want to pay this woman for what she's done. You're going to want to give her something. He said, don't you dare. It is an embarrassment to them to accept payment for hospitality, to accept a gift for hospitality. This is the legacy of my father Abraham. You will not steal this legacy from me by giving me money for what I've done, or by giving me gifts for what I've done. They will gratefully go hungry and without a meal to make sure that a foreigner in their land is cared for. This dates back to here, to this passage of Scripture. Abraham is visited by 3 men, and he says, wash your feet, let me get you something to eat so you can be refreshed, and then you can go on your way. Very well, they answered, do as you say. What does it take to feed 3 people? What does it take to give 3 people a snack? Well, so Abraham he hurried into the tent to Sarah. He says to Sarah, quick, he said, get 3 seahs of fine flour and knead it and bake some bread. About 60 pounds of flour. Does anybody kneaded dough out of 60 pounds of flour? That's about 80 loaves of bread for 3 people. Anybody? You have 3 visitors? You're like, you know what we should do? I'm going to run. You guys just rest here. I'm going to run to the kitchen and get some stuff together. I've got 60 pounds of flour sitting around. First of all, if you got 60 pounds of flour sitting around, you run a bakery. Yeah, where's the back door? 60 pounds of flour made 80 loaves of bread to take to these people. And the Jewish people would point to this and they would say it's miraculous. The way that God provided. And it doesn't say, I mean, it is naturally, there are 318 men, trained men in the house of Abraham. So there are definitely nearly as many women trained. So Sarah probably did not do this by herself, but the text doesn't tell us explicitly that she had her servants help, or that was the expectation of Abraham either. Because the reality is, Abraham, at 99 years old, recovering from surgery, is hurrying around the house to help get this done to be hospitable. How many of us, if we're recovering, somebody randomly shows up, we say, now's not a good time. I'm recovering from surgery. I'm recovering from a sickness or whatever. Instead, Abraham welcomes these men and then goes way above and beyond. Makes 80 loaves of bread about. And then he ran to the herd and he selected a choice tender calf and gave it to a servant who hurried to prepare it. He then brought some curds and milk and the calf that had been prepared and set these before them. While they ate, he stood near them under a tree. He didn't even eat with them. So you got 80 loaves of bread, 60 pounds of flour, 80 loaves of bread. You have a calf, curds, milk. Yeah. I mean, he made a feast for 3 guys and he didn't even eat. This is all for them. And they asked him, "Where is your wife Sarah?" "Where is your wife Sarah?" "There in the tent," he said. Then the Lord said, "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son." Now Sarah was listening at the entrance to the tent which was behind him. Abraham and Sarah were already old and well advanced in years, and Sarah was past the age of childbearing. So Sarah laughed to herself as she thought, "After I am worn out and my master is old, will I now have this pleasure?" That statement that she makes, "Will I have this pleasure?" speaks to the act of lovemaking that would produce a baby. Like he's old and I'm worn out. Are we actually going to have a pleasurable evening together to even get this deal done? Like that's her expression here. And then the Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Will I really have a child now that I am old?' Is anything too hard for the Lord? I will return to you at the appointed time next year, and Sarah will have a son." And Sarah was afraid, so she lied and said, "I did not laugh." But he said, "Yes, you did." Something that sticks out in this, and the reason that we read it as Abraham didn't realize this was the Lord, but we see it later, is because every time it says Lord, every time he says Lord, in reference to him, it's lowercase. But if you're reading it in your Bible, every time it says the Lord said, it's all capitalized. The proper name for God. So looking back in hindsight, speaking, like telling this story again, he finally realizes at the end of the story, this is God who showed up. Yes. It was of his custom. This is what makes Abraham different from everybody else. Because remember back in the story of Lot, right? And he had let Lot go, and then there was this fight. And the king of Sodom was conquered. The king of Sodom was conquered, and Lot was carried off. And Abraham takes his people, his trained men, and he goes and fights and wins back the people. But the king of Sodom and Abraham are standing before the king of Salem, right? And the king of Sodom says, keep everything, just let me have the people. Because it's the recognition of those people that makes him strong. And those people recognize him as king and as Lord over the land, and Abraham didn't want any of it. See, in their culture, everybody wanted everything that they could possess, but Abraham was the only one that was acting differently than this. They'll call it, like, even after this, we're going to skip over this story, the king of Sodom and the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, this conversation and this back and forth, right? There's a certain amount of what the Jewish people would call chutzpah that was possessed in the lineage of Abraham, like so much so that that Abraham knows who he's dealing with finally, and they're going down to judge the people of Sodom, and he's negotiating with God on behalf of the people. So Abraham, in pretty much every instance, may know that he has the upper hand, but he continually thinks of himself less. Even look back at Lot when their herdsmen were quarreling over space for their sheep. That Abraham says to Lot, and he says, "Hey, it's just us here. God has given us all this land. You pick where you're going to go, and I'll go the other way." Even though he clearly had the upper hand, he was clearly the greater in that conversation. And so this is just a continuation of this character, of this man. And so what's happening here is God is showing up to meet Abraham on the backside of this covenant, to begin to fulfill the commitment that he made, that he was actually going to be a father of many nations. But when he showed up, he was making sure that this is still the man that I'm going to partner with. And that hospitality and that chutzpah and that covenant and the belief of God. See, this is what separates, because remember, earlier, before the blood path covenant, God said to Abram, "You're going to have a child." And he laughed. He laughed and had a response, but he didn't doubt God. And the Bible says that he believed God and it was counted to him as righteousness. But it's not said the same thing about Sarah. It doesn't say that she believed God. It just says that she laughed. And then because she was embarrassed, she lied about it. Her laugh was completely different. The way that she laughed was completely different. That's why Abraham's response to who God is and God's faithfulness is so different here. And so we're going to skip chapters 19 and 20 here because we're going to come back to them later. Because there's a story that Genesis 19 is married to, and we want to make sure and keep those two things together. So what happens? What happens is we get a couple of weird stories that happen. About a year later, Sarah has a child, right? And they're told to name him Isaac. So chapter 21 says, "Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised." In chapter 21, sorry. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, and at the very time God had promised him. Abraham gave the name Isaac to the son that Sarah bore. And when his son Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him as God commanded him. So he was keeping the covenant of God in the flesh. And Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. And Sarah said, "God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me." And she added, "Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age." The child grew and was weaned, and on the day Isaac was weaned, Abraham held a great feast. But Sarah saw that the son whom Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham was mocking, and she said to Abraham, "Get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that slave woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac." The matter distressed Abraham greatly because it concerned his son. God said to him, "Do not be so distressed about the boy and your maidservant. Listen to whatever Sarah tells you, because it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. I will make the son of the maidservant into a nation also, because he is your offspring." And early the next morning, Abraham took some food and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar. He set them on her shoulders, and then he sent her off with the boy. She went on her way and wandered in the desert of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she put the boy under one of the bushes, and then she went off and sat down nearby, about a bow shot away, for she thought, "I cannot watch the boy die." And as she sat there nearby, she began to sob. And God heard the boy crying, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What is the matter, Hagar? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. Lift the boy up and take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation." Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. So she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. And God was with the boy as he grew up, and he lived in the desert and became an archer. While he was living in the desert of Paran, his mother got a wife for him from Egypt. So we have been in this we haven't asked this question for a while because really we're in historical information more than um, like a retelling and an intentional retelling. But this particular story sticks out because it's strange. And so I'll ask the question that we haven't asked for a while. Are there any problems, any issues that you have from this story? Like anything that sticks out to you as this is kind of strange? You're smirking back there. He sent his kid off. Well, who initiated the, hey, let's send the kid off? Okay. Sarah said, send away the kid. We're gonna get to that in just a second. So we are gonna get to that. That is the next question. How old is this kid? So so why whose idea was it for Abram to sleep with Hagar in the first place? It's Sarah. So Sarah is dealing with, staring dead in the face, her mistake. And then her mistake comes back to haunt her because she actually has a kid and God fulfills His promises, which should teach us a lesson. If we start to do stuff in our own way and God's provision shows up, ours looks so much worse in comparison, right? So Sarah says, send this kid away. And Abraham's like, I can't do that. That's my own kid. Like, it's so fitting that we got to this place at this time because my firstborn son, today's his birthday. Like, I could not even imagine being like, okay, so here's what I need you to do. I need you to leave. Yeah. I can't imagine my wife telling him to leave. Like, you should get that guy. This is almost like a blended family, right? Like the first child is from the first marriage, and then you have a son with your second wife, and now your second wife's like, that one's got to go. And you're like, what do you mean? Got to go. That's my kid. But then God says to Abraham, hey, don't be so distressed over this. Take a deep breath. Just do what she's asking you to do. And you're like, well, that's weird. Seems out of the ordinary for God, right? Why does God tell him to kick out this woman and his son? Because that woman and that kid out on their own are helpless, right? Like when you read this story, how old is this kid? When you read this story, how old is Ishmael? Doesn't he sound like he's a little kid? Because she goes out leading him out into the wilderness, into the desert, and this middle-aged woman has this kid. They've run out of water, and she's like, I'm going to lay this kid underneath this tree, and I'm going to go off in the distance so I don't have to watch him die. First of all, what kind of mom does that? She's a bow shot away about, right? And here's the question. How old is this kid? How old is this kid? This kid has to be at least 13. He has to be. I have to look back here. Historically, they look at this. The Jewish tradition teaches that he has to be at least 13. And the historical tradition, the timeline says he has to be at least 13 years old. There you go. He was 86 when Ishmael was born. So he's 14, 15 years old. Because again, this is after Isaac is weaned. How old is a kid when they're weaned? That means not on mom's milk anymore. No, it wasn't the day of his circumcision. He was circumcised at 8 days old, and after he was weaned, there was a celebration. A year? A year or two? You think he's older than that? Maybe. So here's what I'm saying to you. So if Ishmael is born when Abraham is 86 and Isaac is born when he's 100, he's already 14 years old. Let me tell you something. So 14, 16, 17 years old, I have a 17-year-old son right now. The chances of my 17-year-old son and my wife being in a wilderness situation and my 17-year-old son dying before my wife is very slim to none. Well, it doesn't matter whether he's pampered or not. There are so few 17-year-old boys, 16, 17-year-old boys that are not going to outlast a 40 to 50-year-old woman in the desert. My wife is not that old. I want to clarify. Yeah, we'll have a conversation about that. I'm just saying, we read this story, and oftentimes we read this story and we start at Genesis 21 and start at 21 verse 1 and we read through it and we're like, he's just a baby, but he is not. He's at least 14 years old. 14. So it's such a weird story to be put in this position, but there is a reason for it. It almost feels out of place, doesn't it? In the whole chronological, if you're reading this chronologically, it really has a challenging position, but there's a reason that it is in this place. And I'm going to explain to you why in just a moment. So let's pick up the story in Genesis 22, verse 1. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to Abraham, "Here I am," he replied. Then God said, "Take your son, your only son Isaac." Is that true? Take your son, your only son Isaac. Does he just have one son? He's got two. Anyway, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about. I want you to understand, from Beersheba, where he just made this treaty with Abimelech, to the Mount Moriah, is at most, if you're walking slow, a half-day journey by foot. About 6 to 8 hours worth of walking will get you from Mount Moriah to Beersheba. Early the next morning, Abraham got up and saddled his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. How long does it take to get from Beersheba to Mount Moriah? About half a day. On the third day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. And he said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there, and we will worship." That's what you do when you're protesting what you're being asked to do. You take 3 days to do what it takes a half a day to do. And Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife, and the two of them went on together. Now, this says placed it on his son Isaac. Most translations say placed it on the shoulders of his son Isaac. As the two of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, or to his father Abraham, "Father," which literal translation would be daddy, Papa. "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and the wood are here," Isaac said, "but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" And Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the two of them went on together. And when they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," he said. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." And Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. And he went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide," or literally translated in the Greek, or not in the Greek, in Hebrew, God who sees, El Roi, actually. The same name as back a few chapters back when God says, when Hagar uses the same name when he says, when she says, "Now I know the Lord has seen me." El Roi, or Roi. Is it Roi? Roi. Back in the back. Roi. But it's R-O-I. Roi. Literally translated, the God who sees. Where'd I lose it? Called this place, "The Lord will provide," and to this day it is said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." And the angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, "I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed, because you have obeyed me." Then Abraham returned to his servants, and they set off together for Beersheba. And Abraham stayed in Beersheba. This is like one of those fairy tale stories. This guy, Ray von der Laan, he says this statement, that this is one of those stories that become like fairy tale stories to us. We hear it so many times that we're like, "Oh, that's cool." But God just asked Abraham to sacrifice a kid. And Abraham doesn't think twice about it. Yeah, not just any kid, his own kid. Now, here's what we have to understand. Every religion outside of Judaism and Christianity sacrifices kids. Yeah, not for this reason. But God asking a man for a child sacrifice would not have been abnormal. Now, what we do see, and what I brought up earlier, is this half-day journey, him making take 3 days out of protest. Go ahead. Yeah. Yeah, that's good stuff. So a lot of people will say, yes, yes, and so that's the Jewish tradition. They teach Abraham knew the direct route, and he took the route all the way around the Dead Sea, which would have been about a 3-day journey, to give God as much time as possible to change his mind. Just God is like, he's not being disobedient, but he's not being he is God knows his displeasure with what he's asking him for. And here's what's really interesting. If you know where you're going and you know what's going to happen, what as a father, because again, we're going to ask this, some similar questions here. Man, how old's the kid? See, we take this picture and we're like, oh, he's young. Okay. You built an altar out of sticks, and this kid carried it for a day. Well, it was on the donkey for the 3 days, and then the trek from where they were when they saw the mountain far off, the servants stayed, they pulled the sticks off, they put it on the shoulders of Isaac, and he walks with all of this wood, enough to burn, to consume a sacrifice. Now, maybe you have never done this, but I'm telling you right now, it takes a lot of sticks to burn a little calf. I mean, think of it. Yeah, I mean, it does. It definitely identifies as Christ carrying the cross, because this is going to be the same hill. Yeah. Yeah. Well, he had to chop the same wood from the same trees. They had to have some years on them. See, we look at both of these stories, we look at these stories, and it's easy to read them and go, well, that's a young kid. No, no. No, these are capable young men. Isaac, at the oldest, was 25. Why do we know that? We know that because he's 25 when Sarah dies. That's the age, right? Sarah dies in chapter 23, I believe, here. And she's 127. So he's 37 when she dies. So he's clearly strong enough to carry this. And so this conversation goes on. There are many people, scholars, biblical scholars, that believe he was somewhere between 20 and 30 years old. It paints a whole different picture. Because child sacrifice is one thing, but adult child sacrifice is completely different. But that's all he had. So you see this even in the as they get to the Torah, as they get to the law part of this in Exodus, there's all these requirements of the law, but if one is not available, it's the best of whatever you have. Well, when you only have one, that's the best you got. Here's why these two stories are very intriguing, and I'll say it to you this way. These are linked. The reason these two stories are together is because they're linked together. So let's talk about how they're linked together. Well, early the next morning, is a statement in the beginning of both of these stories. The word that is used for that phrase in the Hebrew, in all of the first 5 books of the Bible, you only see it in these 2 stories. You only see that phrase in these 2 stories. And they're linked together there. After that, it says that he takes the supplies, right? And he puts them on the shoulders of Hagar. He does the same thing. He puts the supplies, when they get to the mountain, he puts the supplies on Isaac's shoulders, on Isaac's back. The same thing is going on here. And then when they get to this place, Hagar, where does she place the boy? Under a bush. And Abraham, when they get to the top of the mountain, he binds Isaac, who Isaac had to be a willing participant. I have to say that because we overlooked that. And Abraham binds Isaac and places him on top of or over this cut down bush, right? These sticks. Then we see God providing replacement. He provides water for Hagar and Ishmael. And he provides the ram for Isaac and Abraham. And both of these stories end with a covenant from God, a commitment from God on behalf of these people. These stories are clearly linked, and the writer wants us to see them as linked together because the fear and the giving up that happens with Hagar doesn't happen with Abraham. It's the difference in their character. It's the difference in why Abraham, because out of his faithfulness, we see this happen. Now, this story in chapter 22 is marked by this phrase, Hanani. Hanani. That's the statement, here I am. So when God calls out to Abraham, what does he say? Hanani, here I am. And when God calls out to Abraham on the top of the mountain, ready to plunge the knife into his son, and he calls out to him, Abraham, Abraham, pretty much sounds a lot like the beginning of the story, doesn't it? And how does he respond? Here I am. Hanani. Isn't it crazy that we have the very same word and phrase at the beginning of the story as we do at the end of the story? Seems like there might be something else here. There might be a chiasm. There might be a chiasm here. Just maybe. So what do we see? Well, we see, let me look back on my notes. We see they went on together. I think that's the next piece. Boom, boom. Before that, the first one is, I knew it was there. So, we see Abraham take the wood for the burnt offering and place it on his son Isaac. But then later on in the story, we see that they reached the place and Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. And he bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar. So, takes the wood and he puts it on Isaac. He takes Isaac, he puts him on top of the wood. So now, let's find our way closer. Well, it says specifically the two of them went on together at the back end of verse 8. And the two of them went on together at the end of verse 6. And so we find this center point of this chiasm is extremely misleading, because it says, "Yes, my son." And that's how Abraham replies, right? When Isaac says, "Father," or "Daddy." What has been going on here? God has asked Abraham to do something really, really hard. Nearly impossible in most of our minds. If you have an impossible task and you need people to come along with you, what are you doing? You're telling them stories. You're having conversations. You're talking about everything except what you have to do. Because you want your mind to be off of it. And if you are distressed and showing distress and showing trepidation, is that person following along with you? They're definitely going to be suspicious and far more hesitant. So just like every other dad, Abraham has to steel his nerves and say, "Nope, we're going to do this. We don't have any choice but to do this. This is what God has asked of us, and this is what we've got to do." So on this 3.5-day journey now, what have they been talking about? Everything, right? And when it says that, then the phrase that's used here, that Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, "Father," or "Daddy," it implies that he speaks up and interrupts Abraham. That he's been having this conversation, a bunch of small talk. I don't want to talk about it. And as they're going up the mountain, this intelligent young man who has been growing in the favor of God with sticks piled on his back says, "Hey, Dad, I got a question for you." And in the NIV, it translates it, "Yes, my son," is how he answered. But the ESV gets it right. It's this word, Hanani. It says, "Here I am, my son." This is the center of the chiasm. "Here I am, my son," saying, it is the word that is translated this is what is it called? An untranslated, unalliterated alliteration, I think is how it's called, how it's stated. This is the same root that would be translated, "Here I am, here I was, and here I always will be." I'm not leaving. I'm not going anywhere. So when Moses comes up the mountain to God, or when he comes up the mountain and interacts with God at the burning bush, and he tells him, "I'm going to send you," and he says, "Who am I supposed to tell them that you are?" He says, "I am." He says, "Tell them, Hanani, that I am the God who was, and the God who is, and the one who is to come, the one who's never leaving." And it is a call back to who Abraham was right here on this mountain. The center of this story, and the reason that God has chosen Abraham to be his partner and to be identified with, and he continues to point people back to, and he says, "I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob," all throughout the New Testament even, is because of this statement that he makes. God calls out to Abraham and he says, "Hanani, here I am. I'm here and I'm not leaving you, God. I've never gone anywhere. I'm staying right here. And then they're on their way, and to reassure his son that he's right here with him in the middle of this, that he's not leaving him, he will not give up on him, he is going to see this through with him. He's not going to forsake him. He says, Hanani. That same statement, I'm here with you, I've been here with you the whole time, and I'm not going to leave you. And when God calls out again, when he's ready to plunge the knife into the body of his son to sacrifice his one and only son, and for the at least third time being called to give up everything, well, I guess this would be the fourth time, because he called him out of his dad's house to leave all of his heritage behind. And then he told him, then he parted ways with Lot, and then he went and rescued Lot and parted ways with him again. And then now has this son, his only son, the son of promise from his wife Sarah, ready to lay it down again, to give up what would be his heritage and his namesake to continue on again. And God says, stop. Calls out to him, Abraham, Abraham, and he says, here I am. I've been with you this whole time. I am here now, and I am not leaving you. What do you have to say to me? This is the character of God that we need to see from this story. This is the reason that these two stories are next to each other. Because Hagar was holding on to what was her own. And she couldn't bear to watch the sight of it lost. And yes, God rescued her. But the character of self-preservation was not in Abraham. Abraham's statement, and the reason that God continues to refer back to it with the name I am, is a reflection of this word, Hanani. Here I am. It says, here I was, here I am, and here I will continue to be. This is God saying, I'm the God of Abraham. This is the character of God. This is who we are. And this is what God is calling us to be. Such a powerful story if we carry it on, if we understand that on this same hill, God proves that He is. So we're going to spend some time in some small group discussion. If you're not here with us, this is a great time. Like, there's so much here for us to be a part of, and we want you to be a part of it. We want to be able to have conversation, and that's what this is all about, for us to grow together, grow in our understanding of the Word, and really be able to interact with it well, and to be able to ask questions and answer them in a community, because that's where it's all about. So want to invite you to join us on Sunday morning. Should be Palm Sunday this week, I believe. So Palm Sunday coming up. And if you see Nicholas Jackson, tell him happy birthday from April 6th. So have a great day. Love you guys.